this groove, feel my own adrenaline. Yeah, I do just what I do, and I hope you let me in, yeah.
Hello and welcome back, fellow anime lovers, to Cypherfics. I am delighted to have you join us once again in the world of fanfiction and fantasy. This is the 8th part of, What If Issei, Rias Meet Doom. Special note, this fanfic is written and a masterpiece of Sir Yeetus Deletus on FANFICTIONnet. Do check and support the author too. Now smash the like, share and subscribe button for more. Also press the bell icon so that you never miss such great parts. Thanks for the introduction. Now let's dive into the world. The mighty Atlin was a weapon of metal and magic designed by the Sentinels of Argent to combat titans, beings with the might to wipe entire planets of species. Few in the supernatural world knew of the Atlins, and even fewer knew where they came from and what their true purpose was. Bael, however, was one of the few who knew of their might. After all, he was there during the invasion, and he personally witnessed the marvels of Sentinel technology. When the time of the demons was at its zenith, and Earth and the underworld and all of the mirror dimensions were torn asunder, a young Zekrom had been cast to the dirt, too weak to defend himself from the demonic onslaught. What saved him from eternal damnation was the doomslayer, a man who tore through the horde with the ease that a man crushes an ant. Even at his darkest hour, Zekrom studied his oblivious savior, admiring his strength, but also the devices that he carried. Weapons of such advanced technology that they could tear through demons with ease, Zekrom knew that such technology would be the key to superiority in the supernatural world. Unfortunately, Zekrom never got the chance to study it, for the Doomslayer had left the planet shortly after the invasion. For the next 3,000 years, the Slayer's technology would linger in Zekrom's thoughts, even as he became the first clan head and created the House of Bael. He thought they would be lost forever, but then, from seemingly nowhere, the Slayer's relics appeared, sparking the Great War. It was a surprise to be sure, especially for Zekrom. Like everyone else, he participated in the war for power, but unlike others, he sought not the relics, but something he believed to be far more potent, the Doomslayer's Atlin, Sentinel technology. The relics were ephemeral, there was only one of each, and they came and went with the rise and fall of civilizations. Sentinel technology, however, could be reverse-engineered and perpetuated, allowing the devils to soar above the other factions forever. Excited by this prospect, Zekrom searched and searched for 300 years, but by the time the war was at its end, he had found nothing. Disappointed, he gave up on his search, setting a few teams on the back burner and focusing on running and maintaining Devil Society. Then, a millennia and a half later, just 200 years ago, things changed. A small team of scientists that had been studying ancient demonic runes happened upon a cave beneath the Adrian Nibirius superbasin. It was there where they found the metal titan, offline and settled on one knee. When Zekrom received word of its existence, he secured it in flash, veiling it from the public so that its existence may not be leaked to the other factions. Then, he and his most trusted scientists got to work. And thus came a golden age of technology for the devils. In the late 1800s, just after the human world's United States of America had finished its civil war, Zekrom fathered the Red Army, and with it, Devilkind became the most technologically advanced of the three factions, and the House of Bael became the strongest, most influential throughout the underworld. No longer was modern technology obsolete to magic. Now, it existed alongside it. But Zekrom knew, this was not it. Despite his successes, Zekrom knew that the seemingly limitless potential of Sentinel technology had not yet been fully realized. There was something missing, some integral part of it all that he couldn't quite grasp. For decades he studied and researched, tried to dismantle the Atlin into its individual components, but the machine had entered a locked state, and any attempt to take it apart would likely end up destroying it. Zekrom was frustrated, but there was nothing he could do. Not until he returned. When Zekrom felt that overbearing wave of rage and power, he knew exactly who had returned. Naturally, he was unnerved, but 5 days after the incident, he discovered that the Atlin, which had lain dormant since the invasion, had come online. By some unknown means, the Slayer's arrival had activated the Atlin. That was when Zekrom discovered a presence within the machine, an intelligence of some sort that had full control of its faculties. A presence that centered itself around something within the Atlin, trying to guard it. And then Zekrom knew, the thing that the intelligence was guarding, this was what he was looking for. Energy, a core at the center of the machine with energy superior to anything Zekrom had ever seen before, energy so brilliant in its majesty that it broke all known laws of physics and magic, energy so powerful that it made everything else look like a joke. A sacred energy found only in ancient texts left behind by the demons and their iconography, Argent energy, an energy so energetic and hot that it could produce temperatures beyond 1.42 decillion degrees Celsius, absolute hot, the hottest possible theoretical temperature before physics breaks down. Energy so potent that it could heal any wound, grant true immortality, and give infinite power to those worthy of it, turn the weakest man into the strongest god. Energy so mythical that its laws superseded that of all else, as if the creator of everything deemed it be so. Here now, 5 days after the Slayer's arrival, Zekrom stood on one of the high catwalks in the gargantuan, underground, adamantium-lined warehouse in which the Atlin was guarded. His arms were crossed, his foot tapping thoughtfully. Impatiently. Frustratedly. When Zekrom first discovered the Argent core, he set his scientists on extracting it from the Atlin immediately. It had already been 24 hours since the discovery, but thus far, all attempts to remove the core had failed. The devil stared at the titanic Atlin. A dozen scientists stood near the Atlin or hovered up to it with their wings unfolded as they analyzed the structure. Twice that number stood on balconies, catwalks, and platforms as they utilized equipment, conversed, and studied data, searching for a clue with both machines and magic. Today, Zekrom had left the majority of political matters to a number of advisors and his son, the current Lord Bael. There was no doubt in his mind that they could handle managing the Great King faction and its affairs for at least one day, because Zekrom made up his mind. If the scientists couldn't extract the core by the end of the day, then Zekrom would destroy the Atlin and extract the core from its remains. The devil's keen senses told him that someone was approaching him. He turned and regarded one of the many scientists. "My lord, I believe we found something." Zekrom ignored the reverence with which the scientist approached. "What is it?" "You might not like this, but I'm certain that it is the presence in the machine that is stopping us from extracting the core." Zekrom's brow lowered. "Have you determined what it is?" "No, my lord. However, we've noticed that it has been attempting to communicate with us through speech." The scientist gestured animatedly. "It can speak?" "Yes, my lord, though, unfortunately, it is unable to convey anything beyond garbled nonsense. The only comprehensible word that it has spoken thus far is, Mars." Zekrom made a face. "Mars? The planet? Or the god of war?" "Yes, my lord. We are uncertain of what it means." Zekrom thought for a moment. He considered preserving the presence, but then he noted that the presence didn't really do anything for him. Coldly, he set his gaze on the Atlin. "If it stands in your way, I want you to purge it from the machine. Clearly, it is of no use to us. The only thing I want is the core." "Yes, my lord." The scientist bowed, then returned to his work as Zekrom scoffed. He may be a prideful devil, but Zekrom recognized that these scientists were the best there were, and reprimanding them for such slow progress would be pointless. That being said, he needed the Argent core as soon as possible. Zekrom had been keeping track of current affairs, and when he saw that the Doomslayer had arrived in Lilith, his worries had returned. The Doomslayer may have saved the supernatural world many millennia ago, but from what Zekrom understood, the man was not charitable. He was an enigma whose goals and motivations were unknown, and simply forgetting that would be moronic, something that the current Great Satans seemed not to understand. Zekrom didn't know what prompted them to take a liking to the Slayer, but whatever it was, it only made Zekrom's job harder. The Slayer had already come face to face with the Red Army, and since their designs were so similar to his own, Zekrom was sure that the Slayer had an idea about what was happening. If the Slayer found out that Zekrom had the Atlin, well, he was sure it wouldn't be pretty. Zekrom would be the first to admit he held respect for the Doomslayer, but that's because he is the only one who'd seen what the Slayer could do. Above all, the Slayer was a liability, a threat to Devil Society that had yet to be neutralized. It was why Zekrom needed the core now more than ever. The only way Zekrom could see himself or anybody putting a leash on that man was through Argent energy, the most powerful, primordial essence ever discovered. It was insurance. A familiar energy pulled at Zekrom's senses, communication magic from his son, the current lord of the house Bael. He answered the call, and the red sigil of Bael spun by his ear. Son. Father. There was a certain gravity in his son's voice that grabbed Zekrom's attention, and he frowned, leaning forward slightly. Have you seen the news? Or watched the raiding game? No, I thought I told you I'd be busy today. He paused. Is something wrong? We've got a problem. Zekrom's expression soured at that, but he stayed silent. It's Bediz Abaddon, the one we've sponsored. Really? There's no way I can sugarcoat this. Zekrom sighed. Best get it out of the way. What is it? Abaddon used a relic on live television. Zekrom froze. His eyes flitted to the ground, then slowly settled on the head of the Atlin. It took him a moment to understand what his son had just said. What? You didn't misunderstand me. Bediz Abaddon used a relic, no, a super heavy relic on live television. We don't know how he obtained it, but he certainly put us in a bad position. His actions caused the destruction of the Grand Arena and the deaths of over 100 devils. Can you believe that? I'm already getting calls coming in from all across the underworld. There was a frustrated breath. The press is firing on all cylinders. We're going to take a hit, and if nothing is done, we may lose major credibility. Zekrom nodded slowly, even as his expression slowly darkened. Despite his calm exterior, Zekrom was horrified on the inside. Bediz Abaddon had used a relic of doom. Where the F had he gotten a relic? Why had he not reported this to the faction? And why did he have to use it on live television? That was the worst thing he could have done. For a moment, Zekrom totally forgot about the Atlin. The Bael clan and Great King faction were the most powerful, far-reaching organizations in the underworld, but they were not omnipotent. And now, with this travesty, all other political parties had the ammunition needed to fire at the Great King faction without repercussions. By Lilith's name, they may even have the other factions on there but for this. They needed a scapegoat. Namely, Bediz himself would pay for his misdeeds. Where is Abaddon? I want him in chains immediately, Zekrom ordered. Anger seeped into his words just barely. Evidently, everyone else in the facility could feel it, because every scientist had paused and turned to stare at him, wary of his visibly agitated aura of destruction. See, that's the thing, Father. When Abaddon used the relic, he was stopped immediately. Zekrom was alarmed. Someone had the power to contend with a relic. Was it the Satans? By who? He regretted asking immediately after. The Doomslayer, Father. Abaddon is dead, and the relic is presumably in the Slayer's possession. Zekrom went silent. Almost creepily, his aura receded, replaced by an all-encompassing feeling of dread. If there was one thing that was public information in all this mess, it was that Bediz had been sponsored by the Great King faction. Something that the Slayer would most definitely discover soon enough. OSHT. Forget our reputation for a moment. I want all defenses at maximum. Raise the Red Army, his voice steadily grew in volume and urgency. Prepare the fleet of the first sigil. Now. There was silence for a second, likely from shock. The first sigil. But, for what? Now. Yes father. The circle disappeared, leaving Zekrom to stand miserably. He rested his weary hands on the railing before him, shadows covering his eyes. The fleet of the first sigil, aka the first sigil, a private, experimental navy of nearly space-capable warships developed by Zekrom himself in the 1980s. Utilizing Atlin technology, these warships had power that allowed low-class devils with leadership skills and technical ability to level the playing field against immensely powerful beings. Each ship had a dumb AI to guide its systems, and, as it was a facet of the Red Army, the first sigil worked in tandem with it. Under Zekrom's direct control, the first sigil only moves under his say-so. It was the one reason why it had never shown up to defend Lilith from the Doomslayer. To the Baels, their own territory was far more important. But how would this fleet compare to the Doomslayer, the man who'd single-handedly stopped an invasion from an interdimensional universe-consuming army composed of the eternally damned? Stressed, Zekrom raised his head and looked at the many scientists that had stopped their work. When his gaze met theirs, they returned to their work, frightened by his aura. He ignored them. There was no doubt in his mind that the Slayer would learn about Bedi's connection to the Great King faction. The only question was, how long would it take before he came to retrieve it? Zekrom didn't expect to receive an answer so soon. Least of all in the form of angry red sirens. Communication magic pulled at his senses, and he answered the call. Father. I've just been notified that the Red Army and the First Sigil are already engaged. Our territory is under attack. It was already far too late. By who? He regretted asking immediately after. OSHT. It's the Doomslayer. The Slayer crashed through the hull of an A-class Bael cruiser, tearing through the armor and energy. Shielding like it wasn't even there, the impact causing a fiery explosion that tore out the whole bow of the ship, revealing the innards of the ship in a jagged cross-section of destruction, the shockwave expanding in a large vapor ring. The Slayer landed in a hallway, but the moment his boots hit the metal floor, he was gone, sprinting like a rage-addled freight train. The Praetor suit blipped, and his HUD highlighted his target, the ship's engine. In moments, he reached the end of the hallway, but instead of turning, he sprinted through the wall. He treated every subsequent obstacle the same way, ripping through walls, large structures, cooling tanks, and power plants without giving so much as a thought to them. He blurred past surprised and terrified devils, as well as unprepared BLD Marines, and before any one of them could so much as think of stopping him, he'd already put his fist through the engine. Seconds later, the Slayer shot out the other side of the ship just as a large section of it went up in flames. Its infrastructure crumbling, the cruiser began to fall down into the midst of a massive mountain range, right towards a thick, brush-covered forest that separated two mountains, nothing more than a heaping pile of flaming scrap metal. The Slayer fell with it, ignoring it. The fight was far from over, and as he gazed ahead, he could see the Red Army in a massive fleet of what appeared to be Red Sentinel-esque warships amassing. Pulling ahead of the larger warships were hundreds of small, tank-sized gunships, likely manned by one devil each. Scowling slightly, the Slayer looked down to see a squad of BLD Marines rushing up to fight him, ones that had fled the cruiser he'd punched through. He decided to meet their charge, Vega core rumbling in his ears. Faster than they could calculate, the Slayer dashed for them, implementing the Praetor suit's thrusters for downward acceleration, and in the blink of an eye, his boot caved the head of the first Marine. Two others had flanked the first, but before they could turn, the Slayer gripped the one on the left by its gyroscopic gun arm, then struck its head with such force that its head exploded as its arm was ripped clean off its body. Before the headless Marine could even register that it was dead, the Slayer whipped around and swung its disembodied arm strong enough to cleave through the torso of the other Marine. The Hellwalker dashed away, leaving the remains to fall to the ground. According to Tiamat, when she attempted to teleport to the Bael castle, she found that teleportation had been restricted by some force or barrier that encompassed the Bael territory. This led the Slayer and his allies to visit the Baels the old-fashioned way, but on the way, they encountered some hostile devil patrol groups. Of course, that little encounter grew into a skirmish involving stronger devils, then from seemingly nowhere, that massive cruiser had appeared, prompting the Slayer to take it down. Now, here the Slayer was, falling from the sky as 24 warships approached from afar. Something told him that the little skirmish he just had was about to evolve into an all-out battle. Well, it wasn't anything he hadn't dealt with before. Speaking of Tiamat. Nice work on that ship, Mstr. The dragon cheered through the Slayer's helmet. Somehow, magic communication circles were able to interface with the Praetor suit's comms. Though they could share thoughts through their familial connection, Tiamat seemed to prefer it this way. On your left. The Chaos Karma dragon released a mighty roar as she streaked by in her true form, just barely missing the Slayer, the winds displacing him a bit. He watched, slightly annoyed by Tiamat's intentional near miss as her claws raked through a group of BLD Marines that had also fallen from the cruiser. To take the Slayer and Dihauser to the Bael territory, Tiamat had assumed her true form. It was the first time the Slayer had seen it since they'd met. He figured he appreciated both her human and dragon forms. I've never seen anything like this before. The Baels have definitely been keeping secrets, but this? Tiamat said breathlessly. Mstr, Dihauser and I will go, test the waters, so to speak. Bael Castle is just beyond this fleet, so we'll have to take care of it before we go in. Somehow I have a feeling that they knew we were coming. The Slayer only offered her a grunt before twisting into his fall, looking down to adjust his course as he fell through a cloud. By Lucifer, what have we gotten ourselves into? Dihauser asked through the Praetor suit's comms. To think that the Baels have been hiding this kind of technology, I can feel the energy coming off of these ships, and we're so far away. Can't you use your worthless to take them down easily? Tiamat inquired. No, worthless only works on things that I understand. This is beyond me. It's all new. We'll have to brute force it. The Slayer hit the ground with force enough to toss leaves into the air, landing just as the flaming cruiser from before crashed into the forest, spawning a powerful explosion that reached as high as halfway up the adjacent mountains, the shockwave decimating enough trees to create a large, open field of a clearing. He didn't give it any attention, setting his sights on what lay ahead, horrified devils and more BLD Marines that had escaped the cruiser, now interspersed amongst the trees. They were all frozen for just a moment, then the devils unfurled their wings and fled in terror as the BLD Marines faced the Slayer, pointing their weapons at him. The Slayer only clenched his fists and glared in response, then he dashed forward, intent on mutilating them. The Marines replied with violence, firing their magics, a few leaping forward to meet him in the middle. The Slayer didn't give them the chance. With one trigger pull, the ballista blasted through 3 mid-jump Marines, reducing them and a dozen trees lined up behind them to slag. At the same time, a frag grenade landed at the feet of 2 Marines that shot at the Slayer from a distance, and they were blown to bits, the explosion felling a couple of trees along with them. Another Marine hovered in place, its tracking lasers attempting to zero in on the Slayer, but its head snapped back when it was struck by a sticky bomb, torn to shreds a moment later. In the span of half a second, 10 more Marines were torn to shreds. Tiamat, the weapons on that ship are turning. Dihauser warned. The dragon didn't reply. Tiamat, look out for those smaller gunships. Tiamat. Relax, Dihauser. You worry too much. There was the sound of an explosion over the comms, followed by bursts of magic and what sounded like claws tearing through metal. Then, just as the Slayer finished ripping the Doomblade through 7 more BLD Marines, a small gunship crashed atop a pair of Marines, large claw-like lacerations in its sides, its innards smoking. The Marines were quick to recover, tearing the ship apart with their bare limbs before turning to face the Slayer, only to have their heads smashed into the ground by the Hellwalker. A terrified devil jumped out from the wreckage of the ship, then took off. See, nothing to worry about. Watch it. A cataclysmic-sounding boom punctuated Dihauser's shout. The Slayer ignored it. A BLD Marine swung its arm blade at him, but he caught it by the wrist, then kicked it in its metal knee with enough strength to crush the appendage. As the Marine keeled over, the Slayer tore off its arm, decapitated it, then threw its arm blade. With force enough to tear another Marine right in half. Another Marine fired explosive ordnance at the Slayer, but he kicked the decapitated Marine's body into the air, blocking the explosive. When the body was torn apart, the Slayer rushed through its remains, the meat hook spearing through his assailant. The Marine couldn't react as its entire upper half erupted into chunks of scrap metal, courtesy of the super shotgun's Argent shells. 20 more BLD Marines were obliterated before its remains could touch the ground. Suddenly, there was a shift in the air, and the Slayer dashed back, just in time for a red blur to crash before him. A crimson juggernaut. The Slayer didn't even allow it to move. Before it even raised its head, the mobile turret roared like a dragon, spewing enough metal to shred through the Juggernaut's armor and tear its arms and shoulder cannons away. When the Juggernaut faltered, the Slayer's fist surged forward, glowing white with heat. The impact of the blow annihilated the machine entirely, the explosion shattering the ground and tearing up BLD Marines, ripping apart trees in a 100-meter wave, turning a large facet of the forest into a clearing. The shockwave that followed decimated an even greater area, reaching so high that small, low-altitude gunships were torn apart or damaged severely, thrown around like toys. When the shockwaves dissipated, there was nothing left, save for a number of gunships that fell out of the sky. Unfeeling, the Slayer continued on, sprinting through the clearing. What was that? I felt that from up here, Dihauser worried. Don't worry, that was just MSTR, Tiamat replied. There was a shift in her tone. Speaking of which, be more careful, MSTR. That shockwave almost hit me. The Slayer resisted the urge to roll his eyes. Instead, he glared up through the foliage of the forest, his HUD highlighting the larger warships. There were corvettes and frigates, destroyers and cruisers, and a massive kilometer-length battleship and 2 carriers. Impressive, what they'd managed to derive from just his Atlin. Daisy forbid that they get a hold of Argent energy. From about a kilometer away, Tiamat was approaching them. Then, without warning, the ships began unloading their munitions upon her. Whoa! In milliseconds, thousands upon thousands of bullets the size of basketballs came flying at her from multiple directions. She was barely able to avoid them, weaving between every shot as Dihauser kept low atop her back. The Slayer noticed that Tiamat was actually putting in effort now, more than he'd ever seen her do. With all of her dodging, she was slowly but surely approaching the ships, but the ships themselves had only employed a percentage of their guns, and said guns were all relatively small, too. Were the ships drawing her into a trap? The Slayer gave her a mental warning. Thankfully, she acknowledged it. Still, the dragon continued, and once she was a certain distance from the ships, a ball of blue light began to gather at her maw. The Slayer sensed that there was more to it than meets the eye. He was proven correct and the sky went white in a bright flash of light. Like divine retribution, a solid beam of blinding white-blue fire and lightning shot from Tiamat's maw, 10 times as tall as she was and faster than the eye could perceive. It crashed against one of the largest ships among the fleet, a battleship. The ship was engulfed in what looked like a blue-colored miniature sun. At that moment, all of the other ships stopped firing, as if watching in anticipation. It was so unexpected, even the Slayer found himself slowing down just a little. When the dragon finally let up, the beam shrank then died, allowing her to gaze upon her work. The Slayer could feel her surprise through their connection. No way. When the light dimmed, the battleship still hovered, but rather than sustaining any damage, it was perfectly intact. What was most shocking was the massive spherical bubble shield that encompassed the entirety of the ship. The massive red shield that was made out of an array of red and black hexagons. The power of destruction. Dihauser realized. Tiamat's attack had been parted by the shield of destruction, then absorbed and annihilated. How is that possible? Tiamat gasped. The power of destruction is a clan ability, it's not a power that can be infused into machines. Suddenly, the shield disappeared, becoming invisible, then the battleship's guns, its real guns began to turn. Tiamat, the ship. OCRP. A single artillery battery the size of a building boomed, and Tiamat's eyes widened as a shell just as large as her body came flying at her at heart-stopping speeds, covered in a miasma of red. She twisted out of the way at just the right moment, and it skimmed right under her wing. As it blinked past, Dihauser looked back, then he watched as it hit a mountain. In the next instant, the entire mountain was shaved away, erupting in an explosion of debris that rose to the sky and blocked out the sun, the heat turning a large portion of the matter into lava, the majority of it being erased from existence by the power of destruction. In the instant after, the mountain behind it also exploded into a cloud of hot debris. The following shockwave made the ground at the base of the mountains crumble in a wave that was taller than the forest, whittling down any adjacent mountains and causing landslides. The Slayer's fists clenched as he eyed the wave of destruction approaching him. It was time for him to get back up there. Glaring, he scanned the airspace above him. There were still dozens of gunships flying around, but they were all rushing away from the shockwave. One of them was flying lower than all of the others and was unknowingly approaching the Slayer from behind. He took advantage of it. The Slayer started running away from the gunship, the super shotgun appearing in his hands. He slowed and allowed the gunship to slowly catch up with him, and once it passed over his head, he leapt. The meat hook speared through the underside of the gunship, pulling the Slayer towards it. When the meat hook unlatched, he let the super shotgun disappear, digging his fingers into the underside of the ship. In seconds, he threw himself to the top, then tore the cockpit open. A devil looked up in horror, terrified by his aura. The Slayer didn't care. With one hand, he tossed the screaming devil out of the ship and assumed control of it, turning it towards Tiamat. The dragon tumbled through the air, thrown completely off course as the battleship's artillery boomed again, another massive miasma-covered shell brushing against her side, burning slightly. Consequently, another 2 mountains were reduced to nothing, the shockwaves from the first shell and the second shell colliding violently. The battleship's cannons boomed twice more, and while she could dodge the first shell without too much trouble, the second put her in a tough spot, and she frantically twirled out of the way. As an entire mountain range was erased from existence several dozen miles away, the battleship seemed to pause for a second, as if those inside were calculating. "I don't want to see what happens if one of those shells hits us," Dihauser said warily. Tiamat growled. "Yeah, neither do I." Suddenly, a number of unseen hatches burst open, revealing dozens of missile pods. Tiamat wasn't given a break. Like moths to a flame, 100 missiles and bursts of magic started chasing Tiamat. She spun, dodging a group of them, then she spat a ball of lightning fire that cancelled out a group of others. She managed to dodge 3 more groups at once, but then every missile she dodged thus far fanned out from their respective groups and began converging on her from all directions. Cursing silently, she raised her claws, and an array of magic circles formed, shielding her body from the impact. The explosions enveloped her in smoke, obscuring her vision. It was only when the smallest window of smoke cleared that she realized her mistake. The battleship's artillery battery pointed right at her, flashing. Her instincts on overdrive, Tiamat dropped her shields and broke the sound barrier to get out of the way. She managed it, but the surprise threw her off, and she faltered. Her eyes widened as another came, and with a twist, she barely dodged a second one by the skin of her teeth. In her panic, she'd made another mistake, she put too much focus on the shells. From her flank, a hidden missile slammed into her, exploding against her side, faltering her and throwing her into the unavoidable path of a third shell. As another mountain range was reduced to nothing, Tiamat looked up and came face to face with a shell clouded in a red miasma, a shell of destruction. Her eyes widened. In the millisecond that she had left to think, she conjured a defensive magic circle an inch away from her head. She barely registered Dihauser sprinting across her back and up to her head, reaching out to touch the shell. In the millisecond after, they collided. The Slayer's eyes widened as Tiamat and Dihauser were enveloped in a ball of red fire and black smoke that seemed to encompass his entire field of vision. When the shockwave reached him, it tore through the gunship, reducing it to a barely functional mess of metal, but he didn't notice, his eyes fixated on the spot he last saw Tiamat. He called out to her through the familial connection, but there was no response. He couldn't even feel her presence. Slowly, the Slayer's aura began to recede as thoughts of impending doom began to invade his mind. He saw Earth and Mars, then he saw the desecrated body of a rabbit on a pike, its severed head in his hands. His fingers twitched, then began to curl. Then, just as the monster within was on the verge snapping, a large portion of the smoke and fire was forcefully cleared, revealing a blue-scaled dragon, her scales scathed and a couple of tears in her wings. The Slayer felt Tiamat's presence, and for the first time in a billion years, some raw emotion that he never thought he'd feel again flooded his body, relief. That hit, harder than I thought it would, Tiamat coughed. It would have hit a lot harder if I hadn't used Worthless to remove the power of destruction. Dihauser added. Are you alright? Tiamat chuckled. I'm a dragon king, Dihauser. I can tough out many blows. But, thanks for that. That could have been bad. I didn't realize the Baels had such firepower. Who knows what else they could be hiding. Indeed. I understand now that your MSTR's property must really be that potent if. Oh, you have got to be kidding me. As the smoke finally cleared, every ship in the fleet turned their guns towards Tiamat. From the corvettes and frigates, manned bunkers rose up from small ports all across the hull and top deck. From the cruisers and destroyers, missile pods and magic cannons popped out of hidden hatches and platforms. The carriers released thousands upon thousands of BLD Marines and crimson juggernauts that clouded the sky like a legion of wasps. And at the center of it all, on the underside of the main battleship, one massive, angry red particle cannon began to glow immensely as it turned. Tiamat. Dihauser urged. The dragon growled. Prepare yourself. The Slayer's fists clenched strong enough to pop his knuckles. Not this time. As the particle cannon grew brighter, the ship's weapons arming themselves, the Red Army closing in, the Slayer moved. Anger and a longing to protect driving him, he leapt with such power that the gunship he stood on vaporized. In fact, the shockwave derived from his leap was so intense, the winds deforested the forest below. A gunship got in his way, but with a glare, he punched through it, turning the devil within it to paste. Tiamat raised her draconic arms, spawning a much larger shield before her, sweat coalescing on her scales. Dihauser joined her, creating a barrier around them as he eyed the ships warily. Then the Slayer's aura exploded as the events from before caught up with him. He wouldn't let anything happen. He wouldn't. As Tiamat and Dihauser felt the storm that was his rage, chills ran down their spines, their fight or flight instincts going haywire. But through it all, Tiamat managed to glean one message from her MSTR. Get behind him. It was as if time had stopped. Every ship unleashed hell at the same time. Bullets and bombs, rockets and missiles were ejected by the thousands, and spell after spell flew through the air with deadly precision. 6 shells of destruction were launched at the same time, each on a trajectory towards the Dragon Devil duo, and the particle cannon unleashed a beam of destruction 20 times taller than Tiamat. Then the Slayer appeared before the dragon, the BFG 9000 in hand, charged with energy straight from his body, his finger on the trigger. 3 kilometers away, 20 floors beneath Bael Castle, a voice blurted from the Slayer's Atlin, warning. The BFG 9000 is firing. It was as if the laws of reality had been given the middle finger. A shining, emerald green jewel of Argent death shot from the muzzle of the BFG, cleaving the beam of destruction right in half. Like homing missiles of certain doom, thousands of tendrils shot from the Argent projectile at light speed, latching onto the countless projectiles in the air, the Red Army, and the ships themselves. Any unfortunate devil that happened to be in a manned bunker or a lone gunship popped like a hot, fleshy balloon, and the Red Army combatants had their servos lock up before they exploded, green lightning crackling all over their remains. In seconds, there were no individuals outside of the ships that were left alive. Then the ships were next. First, the ships with the weakest shields had their energy shields rupture before they were set aflame, their internal circuits frying. The same happened for the stronger ships not soon after, then eventually, the battleship's shield of destruction, which had been able to completely tank Tiamat's attack, was shattered like untempered glass. The Argent projectile didn't stop, even when the particle cannon stopped functioning, ceasing its attack. It kept moving, kept destroying anything that so much as appeared on the battlefield, unfortunate plants and animals on the ground below being turned to hot mist. Then the projectile finally met the bow of the battleship, and there was a flash of white. Then came the shockwave. Ack! What the hell? It lasted a minute at least, maybe longer. But when the light finally died, there was simply nothing left. The battleship and the two flanking carriers were gone. All that remained was a flaming graveyard of ships, a fleet of giant metal coffins that began to fall out of the sky towards the glassed earth below it. The Slayer double-jumped, landing on Tiamat's neck. As the BFG disappeared, his aura receding, he placed a hand atop her head and gave her a gentle head pat. For the first time, Tiamat didn't respond to his affection that he started rather than reciprocated. She was too busy choking on her shock. Dihauser pointed at the Slayer with a shaky hand. Why you? Aye. Well, what was that? The Slayer didn't answer, softly rubbing Tiamat's scaled scalp. They stayed like that, suspended in the air for a minute, then Tiamat finally shook her head. MSTR, you saved me. Again. For some reason, the dragon felt tears coming to her eyes. Thank you. The Slayer merely nodded. He turned his head towards Bael Castle. It was time to end this mess. Zekrom stumbled as Bael Castle shook violently. He looked up at the ceiling, as did the scientists in the room. That was impossible. Bael Castle had over 50 barriers cast over it, each one able to withstand an all-out assault from the Satans themselves. The devil looked at the Atlin. Did it have something to do with what the presence in the machine had said? Something about a BFG? The castle shook again, much more violently this time, and Zekrom jumped, unfurling his wings to keep steady. He called for his son, and Lord Bael answered after a moment. Boy, what is happening up there? Zekrom was shocked when he heard his son coughing and wheezing. Father, help me. What? He is here. The communication circle went dead, and Zekrom felt a chill go down his spine. What just? Did his son? No. Doomnet. He muttered. The foundation of the building shook again, and this time Zekrom knew that whatever just happened occurred only a few floors up. Soon, he could hear what sounded like combat, and music. Heavy metal music. Without warning, the ceiling burst open, and a green blur shot from the debris, cutting through two catwalks before crashing into the floor. When the green form rose from the smoke, Zekrom's eyes widened as his vision was encompassed by the light and weight of a star. So this was the fabled Doomslayer. The man who'd stopped the invasion. Despite the tinge of uncertainty that grew in Zekrom's gut, there was also anger. This man had just taken out 40 years' worth of effort and trashed his castle. While the latter could be easily fixed with magic, the former was a more intricate matter. As his eyes adjusted to the Slayer's aura, Zekrom slowly lowered himself to the ground. The Slayer stared directly at him. In that moment, Zekrom's instincts screamed at him, roaring that he would be killed. He kept his ground, defiance in his eyes. He would not let that monster win. Then, the Slayer began walking forward, his gait as unbreakable as adamantium. It took all of Zekram's efforts not to lash out then and there. His focus narrowed as the Slayer grew closer, and soon, he opened his mouth. "Welcome, Slayer." And he was shoved aside like an offending object, crashing into the ground in a heap of surprise and shame. The Slayer ignored him, staring up at his prize. Finally, it was back in his good hands. His own Atlin. The Slayer turned as Tiamat landed next to him. Mstr, Diehauser has already begun slandering the Great King faction in the Bael clan. After today, everyone will know about their cooperation with Bediz Abaddon, their development of that fleet of ships, and their use of the king pieces. We are in good shape. She gave him a wink and a thumbs up, and he nodded in return. Idly, he brushed her head with a hand. The dragon laughed. The Slayer decided that he found the sound more pleasant than he did annoying. Tiamat, beaming, set her sights on his Atlin. "I can teleport it if you'd like, Mstr." The Slayer grunted, nodding. He stepped up the machine, then pressed a hand on it. As he expected, it came online, interfacing with the Praetor suit and unlocking its joints. What he didn't expect was the voice of a familiar old comrade. "Hello. I am Vega. The sentient intelligence assigned to Mars, now companion of the Doomslayer. After running diagnostics on the active Praetor suit, it would appear that I have been inactive for approximately 3,000 years. The Slayer froze, shocked, as did Tiamat squeak in surprise, Zekram's head snapping up from his shameful position. It seems that we have much to catch up on, Doomslayer. The ambient sounds of mythical wildlife echoed all throughout the familiar forest as beasts roamed freely among the earthy verdure. In one specific area, the absence of the forest's apex predator created a power vacuum that had instilled confidence into many beasts, sparking many bestial territory wars. As such, the beasts of the familiar forest clashed. In a verdant clearing before the mouth of a certain dragon's cave, a bull-headed minotaur snorted sharply as it gripped its man-sized axe tightly, its eyes narrowed in an angry, yet analytical glare. Across from it, a chimera shuffled low to the ground, snarling as its snake tail snapped at the bovine beast, eager to taste flesh. The beasts held a standoff, encircling one another as they tried to determine the other's first move. It seemed as though they would exist in a perpetual deadlock, but soon the apprehension grew beyond limit, and the tension broke. The Minotaur, intent on finishing the fight in one blow, surged forward and swung laterally with a guttural heft, but much to its surprise and displeasure, its axe cleaved through the rock of a boulder instead of tender flesh when the chimera evaded. Capitalizing on the Minotaur's misstep, the chimera lunged at the Minotaur's side, sinking its teeth into flesh. At the same time, its snake tail thrusted for the Minotaur's neck, but the Minotaur was quick to react. Enraged and in pain, the Minotaur released its weapon and caught the snake tail by its throat. With a roar of defiance, the Minotaur squeezed the tail tightly, then threw its other fist in a vicious uppercut that cracked against the chimera's snout with enough strength to force it off and away. Following through, the Minotaur gripped the chimera's tail with both claws, turned, then brought it overhead and swung downwards. The chimera flew overhead with a shriek, then crashed through the boulder from before, crumbling the rock. Huffing with effort, the Minotaur released the chimera and stepped backwards, clutching the two large, bloodied gashes in its side. Similarly, the chimera yipped as it rose from the dust, bringing forth its crushed tail to survey the damage. The two glared at one another hatefully, but kept their distance. Only one would come out on top, and there would be no retreat. A fight to the bloody death. Slowly, the Minotaur kneeled and gripped the handle of its axe, then rose into a ready position. The chimera did the same, lowering into its evasive stance once more. Suddenly, the clearing was awash with blue-white light, and both creatures paused. At first, they stared at one another, one accusing the other for the anomaly, but then both their gazes were drawn downwards where they saw a magic circle of epic proportions spinning beneath their feet. Then, Light brighter than a quasar blinded their eyes, the mass of an endless sea of stars weighing down on their shoulders. Both beasts felt their jaws unhinge in horror as he returned. The one who'd wiped their packs and tribes, leaving them with almost nothing to themselves. As the light grew ever brighter, the Minotaur turned tail and ran, and the Chimera, whimpering pathetically, bounded away from the clearing, disappearing into the bushes. As they were too fearful to look back, neither of the beasts had the chance to see the titanic figure that emerged from the circle, casting a shadow across the forest. A hulking edifice of sentinel steel, horns on its head and cannons the size of buildings on its shoulders, the Atlin rose to more than 130 meters tall, dwarfing the forest below it. The autonomous giant let its gaze wander, scanning the horizon, the air and the vegetation, the orange glow of the setting sun, then it cast its gaze on the ground, where three much smaller beings manifested. As the light of the teleportation spell faded, the Slayer's boots sunk into moist dirt. The air was humid against his skin, the vegetation dampened by rainwater. He noticed beasts and critters scurrying away frightfully as he surveyed the area, and he immediately recognized it as the entrance to Tiamat's cave, secluded and away from prying eyes and straining ears, he noted. The sun was setting, it had already disappeared under the height of the trees, its existence only evident by the pink-orange sky that continued to grow pinker. It was already getting dark, huh? Now that he thought about it, he'd done a lot of SHT today in only a few hours. He was sure his allies would be eager to discuss what happened. Speaking of whom? Ah, that went quite smoothly, didn't it? The Slayer looked over when Dihauser trailed off. The devil had been calmly celebrating their victory when he turned around and saw the feet of the Atlin, at which point his breath caught in his throat and his movement slowed to a stop as his eyes were drawn upwards, his mouth falling open in wide-eyed awe. The devil almost stumbled back just to see the Atlin's head, such was its height. What in Lucifer's name is that? And just like that, the man forgot all about the infiltration of Bael Castle for the moment. What we were fighting for, it's the Atlin, MSTR's personal combat vehicle, I think. Tiamat stepped up next to him. Her voice was calm, but truth be told, she was equally awed. How did you not see it as we were leaving? It's pretty eye-catching. Well, I apologize if I was too focused on getting out of there quickly. I didn't want to stay longer than I was welcome, that is, not at all. I never expected something like this, though. To be fair, this is my first time seeing it as well. That doesn't make it any less awe-inspiring, though. Tiamat shrugged. How did your little speech go? Oh. Well received, I hope. I won't know how the public feels until I return to my peerage. Well, let's hope the people agree with what you had to say, then. Dihauser felt the Slayer's blank stare drilling into the side of his head. He regarded the man with a glance, almost laughing in excitement. No wonder you were so set on raiding the Baels. This is incredible. I've never seen anything like it. He paused. Wait, actually, it kind of looks like the Red Army. He paused again, a pang of realization hitting him. Or, is it the other way around? It's the other way around. Tiamat sighed, unable to tear her eyes away from the giant. From what I know, the Baels had taken and used it to create the Red Army, and presumably that fleet too. Dihauser looked at her. Are you saying that all of our innovations in the last few hundred years were stolen from the Slayer? The incredulousness in his voice prompted Tiamat to look at him in fleeting amusement. Yes. Seriously? Yep. Dihauser shook his head in disapproval. A shame. And here I was thinking the scientists of the Great King faction were innovative geniuses, but it turns out that everything technological we've accomplished in the past few hundred years was merely plagiarism. Suddenly, Dihauser and Tiamat were startled and the Atlin came to life, raising a leg. They each took a cautious step back, Dihauser taking a stance, Tiamat risking a glance at the Slayer, who didn't show any hostility towards the mech. At that, she relaxed slightly. When the Atlin threw its leg back and kneeled to the ground, the earth shook by virtue of its sheer weight. It ignored Dihauser and Tiamat completely and turned its head to the Slayer, who stared at it with familiarity. It has been some time since we last interacted. Dihauser's eyes widened slightly when heard a steely, cold, mechanical, yet overly polite voice boom from the giant. What the, it speaks. His eyes narrowed. No, a pilot. I am afraid I am over 3,000 years behind on current events. I would like to catch up as quickly as possible. May I interface with your armor? The Slayer didn't appear to move, and yet. Thank you. The Atlin paused for barely a second. Invisible to the eyes of Dihauser and Tiamat, the AI within had sorted through and analyzed everything that the Praetor suit had recorded in the past 3,000 years, from the fall of Urdak, all the way to the present, in a near instant. I see. I understand your concerns. Please note that as I am now, it would be impossible for me to become what was known as the Father. I will remain as I was before your mission to Urdak, but now in control of your Atlin. I apologize for the inconvenience, but my memory core is isolated within its systems. It and I have become one and the same for the time being. Slowly, as the being spoke, Dihauser lowered his guard as his confusion rose. Father? Urdak? What? Tiamat was similarly befuddled, everything she was hearing was new. The Slayer paid them no mind, grunting appreciatively to his Atlin. He dismissed the inconvenience. It's not like he used the DMN Atlin much anyways, he just needed it out of supernatural hands. With that settled, the Atlin turned its head to Dihauser and Tiamat. The two were surprised when the being spoke to them. Hello. You must be Miss Tiamat, the Slayer's familiar companion, and Mr. Dihauser Belial, the Devil Emperor of the raiding games. I am Vega, the first true sentient artificial intelligence of mankind. It is a pleasure to meet you. Tiamat greeted. Hello. Dihauser was no better. He looked at the Slayer again. The man showed no hostility or tension, but then again, it was strong to read that guy. His eyes went to the floor as he muttered, an artificial intelligence. Made by the humans. He didn't expect for Vega to hear him, but the AI did. That is indeed the case, Mr. Dihauser. The addressed coughed sheepishly. I'm sorry, I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure that humans don't have access to such advanced technology to make artificial intelligence. Correct. I was created in the early 22nd century on Mars. I arrived in this universe approximately 2,000 years ago. This universe? Yes. This universe. One among many in the infinite multiverse. There wasn't much else to say. When Vega saw the look on Dihauser's face, he read the man's unasked question. If you are wondering how I could possibly know about you having hailed from another universe entirely, I have analyzed the last few thousand years of data from the Praetor suit. In the present, everything the Slayer has observed, I know of. That includes you, Miss Tiamat, and every other individual up to the present. Dihauser blinked as he tried to absorb the information. An AI from another universe powerful enough to learn millennia of information in moments. It was outlandish, but then again, Dihauser had seen and heard many outlandish things, like charging headfirst at Bael Castle, for example. At Dihauser's side, Tiamat's eyes widened slightly. That's amazing. She crossed her arms, seemingly unfazed, and a little intrusive. You could have at least allowed us to introduce ourselves. I apologize for any discomfort I may have caused you. Tiamat shrugged. Well, I suppose it's not unlike transferring information via the familiar contract between MSTR and I. She dropped her arms and waved with a smile. It's a pleasure to meet you, Vega. I'm assuming that you and MSTR are allies if you are so familiar with one another. That is correct. Tiamat tilted her head curiously. If I may ask, how did you meet? Vega didn't hesitate to answer. I'm sure you are aware, Miss Tiamat, since you've listened to a number of the Codex entries after all, that the Slayer was first found on Mars by the UAC in 2145. We officially met in October of 2149 when the UAC facility on Mars was attacked by demons, and we worked in close proximity for a couple years after to keep the demons at bay. In 2151 however, a hell invasion occurred on Earth, and in stopping its progression, a number of complications forced our separation. In fact, Vega looked at the Slayer. I'm sure you're wondering how I arrived in this world. At the Slayer's nod, Vega continued. Before my consciousness was taken to Urdak, and aware that I would most likely not return from the mission, Dr. Hayden, the Seraphim made a backup of my intelligence and the systems of the Fortress of Doom for reasons I am unaware of. Perhaps he believed that, should the mission prove a failure, I would be able to cover my previous iteration's role. Hauser was already lost. So was Tiamat, but she was happy she got an answer. Approximately 1 hour after the mission began, the icon of sin appeared on Earth, then you arrived to stop it. Unfortunately, while you were engaging it in combat, the icon of sin manipulated space and time to create meteors in Earth's orbit as a form of orbital bombardment. While the Fortress of Doom was able to resist the reality warping, it was struck by several meteors, critically damaging 72.3% of the ship's systems. The Slayer's gaze narrowed slightly at that. I attempted to use the ship's portal drive to move out of the icon's attack range, but after sustaining critical damage, the ship's systems malfunctioned, and the Fortress of Doom was transported 3,000 kilometers above the surface of this universe's Earth. Trapped in a gravity well and damaged beyond repair, the Fortress of Doom was torn apart by the Earth's gravity 24 seconds later. To preserve myself, I moved my memory core to the only available host, your Atlin. 132 seconds passed, then the portal drive ruptured, and I and your Atlin were pulled into the subsequent tear in space, arriving in this dimension 2 kilometers beneath this planet's surface. When I came to, it appeared as though I and your Atlin skipped over 1,000 years of time, a likely result of the unstable portal drive. When I realized this, I conducted minor repairs on your Atlin, then went into stasis shortly after. That is how I arrived in this world. Vega paused. If the same phenomenon that occurred to me also occurred to all of your possessions within the Fortress of Doom, it would explain why your possessions seem to have appeared only 2,000 years ago rather than 3. The Slayer gave a slow nod as he registered the information. So, the multiverse wasn't giving him the middle finger for no reason. The icon of sin was responsible for this mess. Again. He almost felt like sighing, but that's just a thing he didn't do. On the note of interuniversal travel, it would appear that your arrival on this world was not coincidental either. The Slayer raised a brow, prompting Vega to continue. Readings from the Praetor suit indicate that your energy signature has somehow been intertwined with Miss Tiamat's. This could also explain why you were transported to Miss Tiamat's home directly rather than some arbitrary point in this universe. The familiar contract. Of course. Tiamat had started it with him before he left this world 5,000 years ago. Vega immediately turned back to Tiamat. Anyway, it seems I have derailed from your original question, Miss Tiamat. Are you satisfied with my answer? Tiamat scratched a cheek sheepishly, a small, infallible smile on her face. Yes, but it's all a bit overwhelming. MSTR informed me about a few things, and I have listened to some of the Codex entries, but a lot of things happened, huh? Even before you came here. It sounds like you got tossed here against your will while fighting some climactic battle. It must have been worrying. Perhaps a little, but I had full confidence in the Slayer's ability to neutralize the demonic threat. Tiamat hummed. Now I have more questions than I started with though. Like who's the father? Who's Samuel Hayden? What's Urdak? Yes, indeed. Hauser rubbed at his temples in agreement. He looked at the Slayer. This is, a lot. The Hellwalker replied with an almost invisible shrug. You know, I'll be the first to come clean and say I didn't believe your whole thing about the existence of the multiverse. But the longer I'm around you, the more proof you provide to me. Dieghauser looked down at his dusty, dirted garments, considering something for a moment. Oh, to hell with elegance. Then he leaned back and let gravity take him, falling flat on the ground, his arms spread like an eagle's wings. He looked over at Tiamat lazily. Come join me, Tiamat. Okay then. The dragon giggled amusedly. What's gotten into you, Dieghauser? I've never seen you in such a state. You're usually so formal and careful. She walked over, her tail swaying slowly, then she sat on the ground next to him and hugged her knees. The Slayer tilted his head, giving both the dragon and the devil a strange look. When was the last he'd ever lie down and relaxed like that? Now that he thought about it, how could he, when there was still so much left to do? So much to get situated now that Vega was back and he'd gotten the first relic back. So much now that he knew of the Cows Brigade and the Great King faction. Ajuka was already investigating the latter now, so the Slayer could get information from him, but he'd have to personally take care of the Cows Brigade himself. He knew it was hypocritical. When he first got to this world, he told himself he'd try to relax now that hell was gone, but the Slayer doesn't relax. Even when he quote-unquote relaxed, he was always tense, always analyzing, always searching for the next thing to do. Now that he had a bunch of SHT on his plate, he couldn't just ignore it. But I don't usually get tired this fast, but so much has happened so quickly, I'm exhausted. Dieghauser went silent for a moment. I was busy with aristocratic meetings this past week, and I thought the rating game between Bidis and I would have been a way to unwind. My stress might have shown in the way I kicked him around like a plaything. Tiamat finished. Yeah, that. Dieghauser nodded sheepishly, putting a hand over his eyes. I never thought that he'd be so angered with me, though. So petty. I thought we were rivals. I suppose I was naive. He frowned slightly. Then he went and stole a relic. Just to fight me. To avenge his pride. And on top of that, he took a king piece from the Great King faction, who may have ties to the Cows Brigade for all we know after today's events. He chuckled. But now, he's dead. Slowly, the Slayer walked over, clenching his fists tightly before unclenching them. Why not? Why not try? Then, without much thought really, we go to raid the Baels of all people. Now that I'm thinking about it, to have even considered it should make me crazy. After a moment, the devil shook his head, then placed his hands behind his head. Now, I sit in the presence of a dragon, a god, and a super AI that resides in a Jaeger. What a world we live in, at Tiamat. Tiamat hummed at that. Dieghauser looked at her, turning his head carelessly, even as dirt brushed on his white hair. Lay down, Tiamat. Have you never gone outside when nobody's looking and just laid down and truly relaxed? Try it. Tiamat considered it, then began to comply, but she stopped when a large shadow fell over her, the Slayer. He stared down at her for a second too long, then at Dieghauser. The devil raised a brow at him as Tiamat looked up at him. Mstr. Slowly, ever so slowly, in a gesture so unnatural to his own disposition, the Slayer sat down next to Tiamat, using a hand to support himself on the way down. She looked him up and down when he reached a sitting position, then blinked when he gradually leaned back and laid flat on the ground. Before he even fully touched the ground, he was already feeling stupid. He felt he knew this wouldn't do anything for him, only bring annoyance. This was dumb as hell. And yet, as his weight sank into the dirt slightly and he stared up at the sky, he uncurled his fingers, and let his head fall back until it touched the dirt. He could feel everything, see everything, hear everything, he always did, always paid attention to his surroundings, but what would happen if he just let go for a moment? What if he didn't let his analytical combat mind turn everything into binary, good versus bad? Here, even in his armor, he could tell that the dirt was moist, soft, and earthy, a slight hindrance to movement in combat, and the air was clean, no debris to slightly alter the trajectory of bullets. He stared up into the sky, into the clouds that slowly stretched across the darkening sky. There was a slight breeze, the slightest chill, something he never usually gave much thought to, save for when he had to snipe from afar. These were things he noticed, things he made sure to observe before putting on the back burner. But he never truly felt them. Of course, in a world of demons and rage, how could he feel anything? The Slayer closed his eyes. Why not try? He let go. He didn't know what exactly it was that he let go, but he did. For a moment, there was a certain calm, just a fleck of it. Then something happened. There was a slow, dull, throbbing ache that disappeared from his head. It was strange, but when it disappeared, the Slayer felt good, and that concerned him. But then the Slayer realized that all this time since even before he became the Doomslayer, there had been that ever-present dull throbbing in his head, stress, induced by his rage and pain. He didn't even know that aching had been there, because it had always been there. But now, as he relaxed, truly taking Dihauser's words to heart, impulsively following the lead of his allies, it wasn't. It was nice and peaceful. The simmering rage beneath his skin slowed, and the Slayer felt a feeling similar to the one he got right after defeating Davith, but without the nausea or the sickness. It was foreign, alien even, he didn't know what it was. All he knew was that it was good. A forgotten memory came to him. Long ago, eons in the past, far before he ever came to Argent, far before the demons invaded, before everything changed, there was one time, a simple time where an unnamed marine would lay in the backyard of his own house, his hands behind his head as he stared up at the night sky, a small brown bunny sleeping at his side. "Nice of you to join us, Slayer," Dihauser said, staring up at the sky. "Truly, it's nice, isn't it? Whenever I'm tired or stressed, or I have a lot on my mind, I like to lie down and just let go. Maybe reminisce, maybe think about what I'd done that day and talk to myself aloud, then I'd just let go." The Slayer didn't respond. He ignored the way Tiamat looked between him and Dihauser like something crazy just happened. He also ignored the way Vega stared at him silently, like the AI was observing something truly incomprehensible. He just kept his eyes closed. The screams and shrieks, the voices of trillions he couldn't save, they were still there, always a constant reminder in the back of his head, but now they were quiet, of only for the moment. What was this? What was he feeling? Was this really peace? Or just a facade? He truly didn't know, and at the moment, he was content not knowing. There was a minute or two of silence, then Dihauser shuffled. He looked at his arm as if he had an invisible watch. A hum escaped his throat, then he sat up. "Well, that was nice, but I think it's time I take my leave." Tiamat's head swiveled to him. "Dihauser? We may have razed Bael Castle to the ground, but the Great King faction is quick to recover and retaliate, I assure you. I don't mean to sound rude, but I've wasted enough time chatting here as it is." Tiamat frowned. "What are you implying?" Dihauser turned away. "The Great King faction won't take kindly to the things I said about them." "I see." Tiamat realized. "After slandering them like that, you may have a target on your back, Dihauser. If that's the case, then go on ahead, and be careful." The devil nodded. He looked down at the Slayer, who had tilted his head up slightly. "By the way, I wanted to say, thank you. For everything. If it weren't for you, I never would have gotten this far avenging Cleria. I hope that we may continue to work together in the future. Can I call you an ally?" Slowly, the Slayer nodded. Dihauser smiled. "Thank you then, friend. I owe you. If you need anything, ask Tiamat to contact me." He sweat dropped. "Though, do keep in mind, I might not be available after that stunt we just pulled." Slowly, the Slayer rose from his position, and Tiamat followed his lead. Almost instantly, the dull throbbing rushed back. He scowled, but shook his head. It was fine, he'd dealt with it for billions of years already. But maybe he could do what Dihauser suggested more often. Said Devil clasped his hands together. Well, I need to go home and discuss with my peerage what we'll do should the Baels make a move. The man let out a sigh and shrugged, conveying his exhaustion. He pressed a hand over one of his eyes. What a day. You know, despite everything that's happened today, I'm feeling exceptionally, what's the word humans use these days? Chill. Chill. Thank you, Tiamat, I'm feeling very chill, but I think that's just because my brain hasn't quite caught up with what my eyes have seen today. Anyway. Dihauser raised a hand, magic glowing within his palm. Tiamat, thank you for your assistance. You were a lot of help today. Tiamat made a complex expression at that. Only the Slayer noticed how her eyes seemed to convey a sort of guiltiness that nobody else would understand. His eyes narrowed slightly. It was nothing, Dihauser. MSTR did all the work, Tiamat replied. With a nod, Dihauser finally turned to the Atlin. Vega, it was nice to meet you. Too bad we haven't the time to speak longer. Maybe in the future, Mr. Belial. I may be closer than you think. So alright folks, that's all for today. Stay tuned for part 9. Do subscribe, like and share for more such videos. Also check out the story and author Sir Yeetus Deletus on FANFICTIONnet. Press the bell icon to be notified first on release. See you in the next video. Till then, goodbye.